Hello, my name is Pokey Chan. I'm a PhD student from Concordia University, and my research interest lies in digital cultural heritage and game studies. My research focuses on how virtual environments shape our understanding of history and memory. Today, I want to talk about how games don't just reflect history, they shape how we remember it. And one of the best examples is the Kowloon City, a place that no longer exists in reality but is widely recognized in movies, games, and digital media. The questions I want to explore today is how can virtual heritage games provide a counter-narrative to the aestheticized versions of history that dominate popular culture? Look at these images. They may all look real, but in fact, not all of them are real. Some are game screenshots, AI-generated images, or 3D renders. Most people today recognize the Kowloon City not from history books, but from games and movies, and this brings up an issue. The real walled city was not a cyberpunk dystopia. It was a dense but functioning community where people lived and worked. However, because it was demolished in 1993, it has now been replaced by digital representations, and in many cases, these digital versions have become more real than history itself. It leads to my key question. How do virtual heritage games offer an alternative way to think about history? And before we explore that, let's first understand how the walled city has become one of the most misrepresented places in global media. French philosopher Jean Baudrillard introduced simulacra and simulation in 1994, arguing that copies of realities can replace the original so completely that the real thing is forgotten. In the case of Kowloon City, the digital version replaces the real history, distorting public perception. Most people today know the walled city only through its fictionalized cyberpunk version, not the historical records. And these digital reconstructions, such as Stray, reinforce stereotypes instead of challenging them. The more people see these fictional versions, the more they believe them to be real, and this process is shaped by Orientalism and surreality. The Kowloon City is not just randomly designed in games, it has been shaped by a larger narrative of Asianness. Edward Said's Orientalism explains how the West often depicts Asia as mystical, chaotic, and lawless. So you can see that the Kowloon city is turned into a cyberpunk dystopia and exotic, lawless playground for players. While Iwabuchi's Orientalism shows that even Asian games developers reinforce these stereotypes to fit global market expectations. For example, the Paranormal Hong Kong is made by a Hong Kong game studio, and it mixes the real Hong Kong culture with horror and crime stereotypes because that is what players expect. According to the research work I did for my games and research, the former residents described Kowloon City actually as a close-knit community with strong informal economies. The real Kowloon City was not neon lights and crimes as many people would assume. They described the Kowloon City was their home, and even though it was not a perfect place to live. So why do we keep seeing this same stereotypes? This is where Jamie's discussions on serializing Asianness at Chinese Digora last year becomes important. She explains how games make Asianness into something familiar and recognizable for players. Jason Cole's Zero-reality shows that games don't create new depictions, they copy old ones. We can see that from Ghost in the Shell to Stranger Hall to Sleeping Dogs to Cyberpunk 2077, each version moves further away from reality. Now, let's talk about what's missing in these digital representations of the walled city. we have seen how games recycle aestheticized versions of Hong Kong, but they rarely capture the lived experience of the people who were actually there. So, Champion's cultural presence explain these gaps in two ways: Attic cultural presence and Emic cultural presence. So, Attic cultural presence is when history is seen from the outside as something to observe, like a museum or a documentary, while Emic cultural presence is when history is experienced from within as something lived, where players don't just see history but feel being in it. Cultural presence is not a tool. It is something that emerges when designers deeply engage with historical narratives and lived experience. But how do we achieve that? This is where diaspora memory becomes crucial, in my opinion. Diaspora communities are not passive observers of history. They actively preserve, interpret, and reconstruct cultural memory. It is a fact that many Hong Kongers in the diaspora have lived through significant historical events, whether it's political movements, social transitions, or the loss of physical places like Kowloon City. However, the memory are often displaced or erased in mainstream media and games, which tend to focus on simplified, aestheticized versions of Hong Kong history that fit pre-existing cyberpunk and crime stereotypes. But diaspora memory is not just longing for the past, it is a way of negotiating cultural identity across time and space. And one of the most effective ways to capture diaspora memory is through oral history. So, how do we make sure that diaspora voices are heard and that history is not just retold but meaningfully engaged with? So our history provides access to the lived experience of historical spaces. Michael Fritch's shared authority argues that history should not just be told about people, but it should be told with and by them. This means that instead of relying on external interpretations of history, we need to work directly with people who lived through it so they can actively shape cultural memory. Diaspora, when incorporated through oral history, offers an alternative to serialized cyberpunk nostalgia. But for oral history to be meaningful, games cannot just use it as a background information. It needs to shape the way players interact with the world, like allowing players to experience decision-making, social structures, live inside the Kowloon city. So at this point, I would position virtual heritage games not as a fixed solution, but as a space for reflection and historical engagement. For conclusion, back to the question I asked in the very beginning, how can virtual heritage games provide a counter-narrative to the aestheticized versions of history that dominate popular culture? In other words, it means how we move beyond aesthetic nostalgia and engage meaningfully with history. I argue that it would be achieved by integrating diaspora perspective, oral history, and thoughtful interaction design. We can create meaningful digital representations. Virtual heritage games, when grounded in research and community collaborations, offer a counter-narrative by challenging aesthetics, nostalgia, and encouraging deeper engagement with history. This is the end of my presentation. Thank you for making this far.